Hi,
Hi,
how's it going?
welcome. Hi. I'm going to give it another minute or so and then we'll get started.
Okay.
I try to keep an eye on the waiting room there. Chris is now in the waiting room. Okay, welcome everybody to Forms Mastery. We're going to be looking at the Northwest Multiple Listing Service Form number 21, the residential purchase and sale. I cover this in a couple of classes. We'll do about the first half today and then the second half of it next Wednesday. This is the first of 4 classes given in the same order each month. Wednesday from 2 to 4. So again, we do the purchase and sale agreements, parts 1 and 2, the first 2 weeks. Then we do commonly used addenda on the 3rd Wednesday, and the 4th Wednesday of the month is inspection forms and process. And I do these in the same order each month. You don't have to take them in order, but it's helpful. And of course, they're free. Once you've completed all 4 of the classes, you do get 8 clock hours for your continuing education requirements. And Goldie would send out those certificates upon completion of all 4 of the classes. So I'm glad to have you here. If you have any questions as we're going along, please go ahead and ask them. You don't have to wait until the end. And I welcome your participation. Class 2 to 4 clock hour in Washington State is 15 minutes. So we take usually about a 15-minute break about halfway through. So like from, 2:55 to 3:10 right in there. And then we have a little bit of extra time at the end to wrap up and answer any other questions that may have occurred to you. Now, is anybody working on a contract right now, or has anybody already written a contract?
Hey Susan, Chris Brooks here. Not quite yet, but I will be listing my home that we were
Chris,
discussing
yeah,
earlier.
I talked to you this morning. Yeah, great.
Yeah, I'll be listing one possibly as soon as next week.
Oh, awesome. Okay, now I am turning off my phone because it keeps binging. Although I think it's fairly common knowledge that I teach this class every Wednesday from 2 to 4. Somehow, once it gets to 2, people, start calling me. I don't know why. Same thing whenever I have a meeting. It's like Murphy's Law. We're gonna cover Form 21. That's a purchase and sale for residents. But the format is pretty much the same on all the purchase and sales. So whether it's multifamily, manufactured home, condominiums, or vacant land, they're pretty much the same format. And since the Form 21 is so commonly used, we're going to focus on that one. So if you do have the ability to pull up a Form 21 in the MLS, you would go log onto the MLS, go to Express Forms, and in this search bar, you put in 21 for the residential purchase and sale, because we'll kind of break it down line by line. And then we'll be referring to the paragraphs on the subsequent pages of Form 21 that refer to the individual items on page 1, because there's some explanations and expansions on those concepts in those following pages that we'll be talking about. So Colton versus Heritage House was a landmark case in Washington that tried to stop realtors from writing contracts. But the Washington State Supreme Court says that realtors can write contracts, provided that we are filling in forms that have been approved by attorneys. We're not allowed to write our own contracts, so you can't write up something on a napkin or, freehand it. We have to use the statewide forms. That's part of being in the MLS, and that's what we're licensed and permitted to use. In fact, I had a situation recently where one of the brokers in the firm got an offer from a buyer, and it was on an outdated purchase and sale form. And as you may or may not know, these many of the forms, about 30 forms, were revised effective July 11th of this year. And we had some additional forms created for our use as well. So our broker called me up with a question. Well, what do I do with this offer? It's written on outdated forms. Can I, counter it the way it is? Do I need to rewrite it or what? So the answer was, we are not licensed to use those old forms. We're only licensed to use the current forms. I think in this situation, the buyer was a former realtor, and maybe she had some old forms floating around because they're not available on the MLS anymore. And so she used one of those old forms, but that was not acceptable. So I had her rewrite the contract with all the buyer's original terms, except for the ones that the seller wanted to change. So in essence, she rewrote the purchase and sale and incorporated the counter offer terms that the seller wanted to include in that purchase and sale, and then sent it back to the buyer for review and, hopefully acceptance. I did not hear any more after that. So usually it's kind of a no news is good news. So I'm assuming that they came to mutual agreement and proceeded. So this just underlines the concept that we're only allowed to use the current approved forms in the MLS system. Remember too that when you're writing up a purchase and sale contract, you have to be representing someone. If you say, and this happens, this may happen to you, that you have a friend or a family member that says, oh, cousin Charlie wants to buy Aunt Marge's house, and they don't really need any, real estate representation because it's a family deal, all the terms are agreed upon. They just need somebody to write up the contract. So can't you do that for them? Well, the shorter answer is no, you cannot, because you must represent one of the parties. Otherwise, you're essentially practicing law without a license. So whether you represent the buyer or the seller, represent both of them, any of that is okay. Dual agency is a bit more of a challenge, even for experienced brokers. But because it's hard to sit on both sides of the table, but it can be done successfully. So just remember that you do need to represent one of the parties when you are using any of the MLS forms. And honestly, I feel that you should be able to articulate your value and in terms of your knowledge, your expertise, the legality and correctness of the contract. And all of that is worth something. And none of us can afford to work for free, right? So you should be compensated in some part for your efforts. So that's a great way to show value to your client, is understanding these rather complicated forms. And they have gotten, we have a lot more forms. There are over 100 in the statewide system now. And one of the reasons for that is they keep identifying new scenarios that can be addressed with a specific form. For example, we used to just have one septic addendum. Now we have several because we have several that are county specific, because each county has a different governing body and has a different name for the specific forms that need to be completed prior to closing and that sort of thing. So instead of having to freehand addendum, which we are discouraged from doing, it's very important to search and find the correct form. And believe me, I get a lot of calls with brokers saying, here's my situation. What form do I use? And you know what? I would say probably 9 times out of 10, I will say there is a form for that. And if you have to write an addendum addressing a specific negotiating point or some issue in your contract, please call me so that we can make sure we get that done correctly. There are a lot of elements that are necessary for a legal and binding addendum, and we'll probably cover that more when we talk about commonly used addenda. But for example, what needs to be done, who's going to do it, who's going to pay for it, what's the deadline for it to be done, and what happens if it's not done. So it can be a little bit complicated. Okay, let's just dive into, does anybody have the form pulled up, or everybody that wants to have the form pulled up, have you got it? Okay, let's just start out with page 1, top of the page, left-hand corner, line 1 is a line for the first item is a line for the date. So this is the date that you're actually writing the offer. This isn't the expiration date, it's not the closing date, it's not tomorrow, it's not yesterday, it's today, the day you're actually writing the offer, and it's just a simple reference point. And I would take this opportunity to say, when you are writing an offer, it's prudent to go ahead and get some information pulled prior to doing so. Of course, you'll have the listing information, but you're also, it doesn't hurt to have a property profile, legal description, and a map. And that's all a matter of public record. How can I easily get that? Well, you can call your title company and ask for that information. Typically, they call it a trio or a Head Start packet of information. It's the kind of thing you would order when you say listed a property, but it doesn't hurt for you to have it as part of your file as well. Occasionally, somebody will upload an incorrect legal description to a listing, and I always like to cross-check that. And you can always share that information with your client too. Your MLS number, obviously that's going to be on the listing information. Make sure you put that in correctly. And if you are using Transaction Desk to create your offer, if you put in the MLS number correctly, it's going to pre-populate a lot of the information that you're going to need, and you won't have to retype it page after page. So make sure you've got the correct MLS number in there, and that's going to save you some time. The next field is the offer expiration date. So this has a correlative paragraph. It's paragraph S on the 5th page of the purchase and sale. And it says that if no expiration date is specified for the offer or counteroffer, the offer or counteroffer shall expire 2 days after the offer or counteroffer is delivered by the party making the offer. So how do you decide how long you're going to give the seller to respond? 2 days is kind of a standard amount of time. I really prefer you to fill in the blanks on the contract and not leave them blank. I don't like any guesswork on contracts. And not everybody has read paragraph S on page 5 and realizes that 2 days is the default time frame. you don't want to give the seller too much time to respond, but you don't want to make it unreasonable either. If you give too much time, say you were a listing agent and you got an offer and you had 4 days to respond. What would you be doing with that 4 days? Well, if it were me, I'd be calling everybody that had shown the property or expressed an interest and tell them I've got an offer in, get your buyer off the fence and get me in an offer, because I'm going to be presenting to the seller and we're going to look at them in 4 days. So you don't want to give the seller so much time that they have a chance to find competing offers or generate competing offers. But on the same or the flip side of the coin, really, you don't want to alienate anybody by creating an unrealistically short response time. Be sure and read your listing comments. And it might be, say it's an estate, they've got a number, we've got 3 heirs and they all live in different states, different time zones. So we may need a little extra time to respond. You can also check with the listing agent. We're giving you 2 days. I'm writing an offer. We're going to give you 2 days to respond. Any extenuating circumstances you can think of. Well, they might say, oh, gee, my client's, coming back from Korea tomorrow. They're going to be on a plane all day. And so, I'm going to need an extra day. So this sets up a nice working relationship initially with the other side, to be a little bit considerate of the seller's schedule and keeping in mind, of course, your own priorities with getting as fast a response as you can for your buyer. But I like to make a list of questions and comments for both the listing agent and for your lender, that you're going to need information from each of those sources when you are writing an offer. So number 1 on your list here, when you talk to the listing agent, is confirm expiration date okay. And that, can build a nice rapport. As we don't have too many bank-owned properties on the market, but if you are working with an entity like a bank, or if it's a relocation firm that is actually selling the property, maybe the title's already been transferred to the relo firm, and so you'll be dealing with those folks through the listing broker. They kind of work on their own timelines. So that would again be a question for the listing agent. How's this going to affect our expiration date? How much time does this relo firm or bank need to respond? So you just want to make sure that your buyer is being treated fairly and manage your buyer's expectations, because buyers, once they submit an offer, they want to know right away. They're so antsy to find out what the response is going to be. And I always tell my buyers, as soon as I know something, you'll know something. But we've given them 2 days. So, let's when we get close to the deadline, I'll be checking on it and I'll let you know as soon as I know. So that helps a lot. Then they're not calling you every 2 hours and saying, have you heard back from the seller? Remember that an acceptance must be communicated in writing. So even if you get an email, if you are, listing agent might call you or email you and say, thanks for the offer, it's great, I'm sure my seller's going to accept. Do not tell your buyer that. Nothing is final until you get it in writing. There is a law in Washington called the Statute of Frauds that stipulates that all contracts must be in writing or they are not legally binding. And it's a really awful scenario if you say to your buyer, oh, I just heard from the listing agent, they love the offer and they're going to accept it. And guess what? 6 o'clock, 7, 8, 9 o'clock comes, you still don't have that acceptance. You call the listing agent, what's going on with my offer? And they say, oh gosh, so sorry, we got another offer in that was better. Seller decided to respond to that one. So then you've got the task of calling up your buyer and explaining that you're not getting your offer accepted after all. So just keep that close to your vest until you actually get the signed around offer from the seller. And by the way, when you're sending out these offers and any communication, any other forms that are attached to the transaction, they have to go not just to the listing agent, but also to the listing brokerage firm. And there is a place on the bottom of the page where all the contact information is, for the seller and the listing firm, the listing broker, and the firm's email address, as well as the listing brokers. So make sure that you're CCing them both, or you're sending it both to the listing broker and to their firm. And like for us, it goes into, we have a KWFW broker email address, and it's not really, it's not a place to email me for questions or problems, but it's more of a document storage, so that if we need to go in and prove when something was received, we've got that information on hand. So what happens if your offer expiration comes and goes, and then you get an acceptance? Well, technically, you would need to draw a line through the original date for the expiration, write in the new date, and have each party initial and date the change. So that's the correct way to go, but many agreements proceed without doing that because it is a legal theory called promissory estoppel or ratification. And it means that if all parties take action as though everything is valid, then it becomes valid in retroactively. But I prefer to have it corrected and signed around. But we don't really like to take risks. We'd rather button it up. Remember that the buyer's offer can be revoked at any time prior to receiving written notification of acceptance from the seller. So if you ever wanted to withdraw an offer, there's a form for that, and it's 36A. Same thing with a counter offer. You can send over a counter offer, and if the buyer decides that they don't want to proceed, and wants to withdraw that, again, you can withdraw a counter as long as written acceptance has not been received. Okay, line 2, buyer's name. Here we're gonna, guess what, write in the buyer's name. You want to put in their full legal name with the correct spelling. Don't guess. If there's any question, or you're having a hard time wrapping your head around the spelling of the buyer's name, ask them to look at their driver's license and take the legal name right there. You don't need to advise them on how they're going to take title. That means how their name is going to read on the deed that transfers title from the seller to the buyer. That's a legal practice that really exceeds our authority, and it's really up to the lender and the buyer. So that would be a question for your list that you're going to put on questions I need to ask the lender. Do you know yet how the buyer is going to be vested, so that you can write it in correctly? Married couples, always best practice to have both of them sign, both of them on the title and both of them sign. Marital status, you want to fill this in. Again, this is a question for the lender as far as how that's to be written. So, for example, it could be Chris Brooks, a married man, Chris Brooks. And what's your wife's name? What's your wife?
Renee.
What? Renee?
Renee.
It could be Chris and Renee Brooks, a married couple. It could be Chris and Renee Brooks, husband and wife. You see where I'm going with this? It could be a single person, a single man, an unmarried man, a single man. It just, there are different ways of saying the same thing. And that's a question for the lender. So that's how are they going to be vested? Not just how their name is going to read, but how their marital status is to be phrased. And it's important because all the documents will have to match. So the way that the buyer's name reads on the purchase and sale has to match the way it reads on the loan documents and on the closing documents and on the deed that vests the ownership in the buyer. So that's your first question for your lender there. Okay. If you have an artificial person for a buyer, so what would that be? Maybe an LLC, a corporation, a company, or maybe you have an estate. They have to be identified properly there. And that's another good reason for getting initial that initial property profile, legal description, and map. And if there's a preliminary title available, definitely read that before you take a look at it before you read the or before you write your offer. It'll have some good information, like the name of the seller. Does that match what's in the listing? It's always good to check. There is fraud out there. Legal description attaches Exhibit A. So in order to comply with the MLS rules, all listings must have a legal description attached. Again, cross-check it with what you get from the title company and make sure it's the right legal description. And check your supplements when you're, before you start to write your offer. A lot of times listing agents will have in there a initial legal description. It's already been initialed by the sellers, and you can grab that and attach it to your offer. Sometimes there will be other addenda that will be useful to you. If the property is older than 1978, there'll probably be a 22J lead-based paint disclosure form. That's a national requirement. I mean, it's not just a local thing or an MLS thing. It's nationwide. You have to have that lead-based paint disclosure form. Also, many agents will have their sellers fill out the utilities addendum 22K, and possibly a seller's disclosure form, which is nice to grab and have your buyers read over as well. Anything that's in the supplements you should take a look at and attach as relevant to your contract that you're writing. The tax parcel numbers, I think that if you put in the correct MLS number, the tax parcel numbers will automatically populate. Check that against your property profile that you get from title, and make sure that, say if it's 2 parcels, make sure both the parcels are on your contract. Otherwise, your client's only buying one. And once in a while, I mean, listing agents we're all human, right? That's why they put erasers on the ends of pencils, or where they have the delete function on your keyboard. Once in a while, somebody will make a mistake and they won't have the correct parcel number in their listing, or they will have one but not the other. So important to make sure you've got a legally enforceable contract, that your buyer's purchasing exactly what they saw and what they want, and that all needs to be included on your contract. I think that the address would auto-populate for you too, as far as the subject property, address, city, county, state, and zip. Okay, how are we doing so far? Any questions? Okay, awesome. Okay, line 5. This is one of the things that was recently revised, and the revision, the sum of the revision is that they added an S to all the appliances. So they made all the appliances plural. And they also added attached TVs, because so many are attached now. And they added attached cameras because we're seeing more and more cameras attached properties, whether it's a Ring doorbell camera or a security camera inside or outside the house. And by the way, when you're showing properties, I would tell you to advise your clients not to make too many comments about the property while you're still inside. You should do your viewing, and then, you know, if they have questions, you know, you can certainly answer them, but I would be real careful about saying, oh, I hate the color of this bedroom, or, you know, this kitchen tile is disgusting, or anything negative, because you know what, that might be being recorded, and your seller isn't going to be kindly disposed to you if they feel that their property has been unfairly criticized. I mean, it's just human nature, right? So err on the side of caution, and, you know, you can always talk about it in the car afterwards, or you can go for coffee afterwards to discuss the properties that you've seen and weigh the pros and cons of each one. So by checking these boxes, this on item 5, this means that these items are going to be included in the sale. And since they're in all now plural, if you check, say, the refrigerator box, and if for refrigerators, and there are 2 refrigerators in the property, that means that both would be included. Now, if there's an exclusion on the listing that says refrigerator in garage to will not convey, that means it's not going to be conveyed with the property. It's going to go with the seller. And they might just say excluded or go with the seller. Then you would want to make a note of that on 22D or optional clause addendum. There's a place to fill that in there. Otherwise, the buyer is going to be entitled to whatever appliances are in the house that you check the boxes. So what if the washer and dryer is excluded in the listing, but the buyer says, oh gosh, this washer and dryer is so much nicer than the one I have at home. I'd really like to have this, and it just fits so well in here. I think it'd be really hard for me to find something that fit into this space. Can we ask for that? Sure, you can ask for that. Even if it says we're excluding it, you can still ask for it. You're making an offer. This can be part of your offer. And if your buyer wants it, you know, ask for it. Worst that can happen is the seller will say, no, we're going to take that with us. Lately, we've had we did have a couple problems regarding appliances. In one case, there was a situation where there were 2 refrigerators, and there was a really nice state-of-the-art one in the kitchen, and then there was an older, more basic model in the garage, right? So the buyer, this was before the forms were revised, and the buyer had checked that they got a refrigerator, just one. And they didn't specify because they assumed they would be getting the one in the kitchen. Well, the seller had just bought that fridge fairly recently, and it was rather expensive, and they looked at the brochures and sale. The buyers want a fridge. Okay, well, we will leave them a fridge, but we're going to take the nice one, and we're going to move the one from the garage into the kitchen. Well, needless to say, the buyer went to do their walkthrough prior to closing. And by the way, always do your walkthroughs. And the good fridge was gone, and they were extremely unhappy that they were not getting the fridge that they had seen, that they felt, you know, a bit cheated, right? So the way this was solved was that because of the misunderstanding, the seller ended up giving the buyer a credit. I think it was about $1,500 to kind of compensate for the fact that they took the good fridge. So it doesn't hurt to document especially if they're really, you know, top of the line, you know, Wolf, Bosch, you know, some really expensive brand, take a picture of it. Or if the listing photos are good and you can actually tell what the brand is from the listing photos, save that to your transaction file so that you've got record and you've got proof of what was in the property when you showed it, that is supposed to be included. And it's not all that common, but it does happen that people will switch out a less expensive model for the nice new one. So if you are going to get, say, just one refrigerator, make sure you note the brand and the model number that you're getting for your client so that there's no question and you don't have that, oh, we're 4 days out from closing and we're in a dispute kind of situation. This paragraph, line 5, does have a correlative paragraph, and it is C, which is included items. It's on page 2 of your purchase and sale. And it says that, just explains kind of what I said. Any of the items where you've checked the box, they're going to be included. And the things that are assumed to be included, does anybody remember the phrase appurtenance from their real estate test? Okay, good. So basically that's something that's affixed to the property, and a lot of weight is given to intent. If it's intended to become part of the property, a permanent part of the property, if it's nailed down, if it's bolted down, if it's, fastened to the wall, if it's installed. So some of those things are, and I'm looking at line 41 on page 2 of Form 21. Built-in appliances, wall-to-wall carpeting, curtains, drapes, window treatments, window and door screens, awnings, storm doors, windows, installed antennas, ventilating, air conditioning, heating fixtures, trash compactor, garbage disposal, fireplace doors, gas logs and lighters, irrigation fixtures, electric garage door openers, which are like keys. They are so specific to the property that they are considered appurtenances, even though they're not nailed down. Water heaters, electrical fixtures, lighting fixtures, shrubs, plants, and trees planted in the ground, and all associated operating remote controls and access permissions. So if you're selling a property, you want to make sure that you leave those operating controls and also the access codes. A lot of people have the remote blinds now, or maybe you've got a really tall vaulted ceiling. You've got a ceiling fan up there that can only be operated with a remote. I mean, it might have a wall fixture, or a wall switch, but maybe just a remote. So unless otherwise agreed, all of these things stay, and if they're leased or encumbered, sellers shall acquire clear title prior to closing. That means if they owe something on their water heater, they got to pay it off before closing so that buyer can acquire it free and clear. So make sure you double check your listing regarding comments about any excluded items. I've seen chandeliers, certain window coverings, and shrubs, and that all kinds of things, doorknobs that Tracy, do you have a good example, a good story for us?
I had, I think about a decade ago, I purchased a property that had a pond that I didn't know when I got the key, it was gone.
The pond? Oh my gosh, how do you remove a pond?
Apparently, it was one of those where you laid the black tarp, which I didn't even know because I didn't care. I mean, I was just shocked.
Yeah.
So that was something, I guess, lesson learned from this. So I'll be on the lookout for my customer for, that situation, because I've
Yeah.
never heard of, they took the fan, they took lighting fixture. I'm like,
yeah.
there's cords
So
sticking out.
again,
That wasn't
really important to do your walkthrough, and there is boilerplate language in the purchase and sale, that allows the buyer permission and access to do a walkthrough within 5 days of closing. So better not to wait till the day before closing or the morning of closing that you're doing your final walkthrough and have a nasty surprise. Because if you've got a couple of days, you've got some time to negotiate and call it, and we don't, as brokers, we can't control every move that the seller makes. And, TVs were supposed to be left, but they got packed up by accident, or the patio heaters were supposed to be left on the patio, but, the seller's adult kids came and took those because they didn't realize they were included in the sale. Both of those things have happened recently, by the way. And so it's important to give yourself some time to rectify that situation. So either, maybe the seller will return the item that was taken mistakenly. Maybe they'll offer the buyer some extra money towards it. Certainly, if they've done something like taken down a light fixture, they should replace it with something of, comparable style and value. But it doesn't always happen. Oh, I had a client one time that wanted Franklin. Oh, I think the seller did not mention that the Franklin stove on the property had great sentimental value for them. They were selling their parents' house, right? And so they wanted it, but they neglected to tell their listing broker about this. So it wasn't mentioned in the contract. And the buyer absolutely wanted that. And then when the offer came in and that was included, then the seller countered it. They didn't want to give up that Franklin stove. And so it ended up, again, it was a monetary exchange that they gave them a little bit of a credit toward buying a new Franklin stove because they just had to have that one from the house. So be sure and read your listing carefully and really talk to your buyer about their expectations and manage those a little bit again, because if they are expecting to get that antique chandelier in the dining room, but it's been excluded in the listing, the odds are that the seller's not going to want to part for it. They might throw a little money at the problem to make it go away, but they might not. They might just say, no. And you don't really want to set up your offer for a counter over a small item like that, if at all possible. Okay, let's move on to line 6. So this is for purchase price. So here's another item to put on your list for your lender. Obviously, you've talked to your lender about the type of loan that your buyer's getting and what they can afford. And I used to call my lender before I would be, or the buyer's lender, when I was going out to show. So they kind of have a heads up that if we saw something we liked that day, I might need an updated pre-approval letter. So I like to have my pre-approval letters match my purchase price exactly. I didn't want to have a pre-approval letter that said, congratulations, you're pre-approved for $550,000 if I wanted to write an offer for $525,000. See where I'm going with this? So one thing you will need to do when you're discussing the offer with your buyer is to run comps on this property. And I don't want you to specifically give a number to the buyer. It's totally up to them as to what they're going to offer for the purchase price, based on what they can afford. But you also need to find out, you need to evaluate, where do we need to come in to be competitive? Does that fit into what your buyer can afford? And then you need to ask your lender if you're going to need closing costs, right? So that would be attached on your financing addendum at the top of page 2, where it says seller's contribution to buyer's closing costs. So that's a really important conversation to have both with your buyer and your lender, to make sure that everybody's on the same page. You sure don't want to make an offer that your buyer or your lender can't support. That's a recipe for disaster. Also, when the comps that you run to support your recommendation for a purchase price or your discussion with your buyer for a purchase price, make sure you get that into your transaction file, because that's an important component in your record keeping.
Susan, do you primarily do that in desk?
Sorry.
Then is that where
I'm
you
sorry,
keep all your transaction files? Or
say that again. Is that you, Chris?
yeah, you're breaking
Oh,
up on me
you
real
kind of
bad.
froze up there. Say it again. You're asking a question about your transaction file?
Yeah, do you store those within transaction desk, or is there a different location you keep all these
Well,
files?
you can create it in transaction desk and you can leave it in there, or you can delete it, when you don't need it anymore. But what you'll do is you will create an opportunity in Command. So that's our platform for document storage. And that's where you submit everything for review and, a compliance review. And that's basically where you can create the transaction desk, but then, once you get your offer signed around, then you're going to upload it to Command. And then also in Command, there is guess what? A commissions tab where you get to create your commission request. And then that goes to the Market Center administrative team, and that's Gwen and Emily, for them to have that information. So once you get to closing, you can get paid, because they'll create a disbursement authorization form and send it over to escrow. But they need your information input there too. So,
Gotcha.
Are any of you working with mentors? Because they can help you some with Command. Yeah, Tracy's giving me a big thumbs up. Okay, awesome. Suleiman, yeah. Chris, yes. If you need help with Command and you don't have a mentor, Emily Williams is a good resource for that. She holds a tech workshop, one, I believe, on Wednesday every week in Kent, and one on Friday in Federal Way. I don't know if I have the calendar. I don't know the times. Oh, here, Tracy's going to hold up her calendar. Okay, Tracy, what time is the tech workshop with Emily on Wednesday in Kent?
It's
I
from
can't
one
read
from
it.
one
Just
to
tell me.
from 1 to 2.
1 to 2 in Kent. Okay,
Uh-huh.
in Kent on Wednesday. And when is it in Federal Way on Friday?
Yes. This Friday it's from 1 to 2
1 to 2.
at Federal Way.
Okay, in Friday.
Uh,
Awesome.
Yep.
So the
So
way those work is she doesn't teach a topic, but people show up with their laptops and say, I need help with importing a database to Command, or I need, help with creating a commission or something like that. And she kind of goes from one person to the next and helps them solve their problems. So that's a nice built-in scheduling opportunity for you. Tracy?
from 10 to 11 every Wednesday at Kent.
Kent is 10 to 11 on Wednesday. Federal Way is 1 to 2 on Friday. Okay.
Yes.
And on a more limited basis, I mean, you can call Emily for individual assistance as well. You know, for me, I've seen her do that a lot. Somebody will just say, I need 20 minutes or I'm stuck, you know, can you help me out on this issue? And I have never heard her turn anybody down for help. But if you need, for me, I'll spend 15 or 20 minutes on something. If I can't solve it, you know, I get into these technology cul-de-sacs where I'm just going around and I keep going around the same circuit and I keep getting to a dead end. After 15 or 20 minutes, I figure somebody else can get me out of this maze. And so don't spend too much time spinning your wheels. There is help available, either through your mentor or with Emily. But probably don't call me because I review contracts, but I don't input a lot of stuff in command. So, okay, we are at just a little bit before 3. Why don't we I've got a couple of phone calls I've got to return. So let's take a break now until about 10 after, and I will see you back here then. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
I am back. Here I am. Had a phone call that ran over time. Sorry about that. Okay, everybody have a chance to get some water? Or maybe I'm the only one who needs, because I'm talking all the time. Suleiman, how are you doing? What have you got to say?
Nothing really. I've been having a long day. I've been busy since 8 today.
Oh
I've
my,
been, yes, it's one of my busiest days since I started.
wow.
I also attended the Northwest MLS training. They had a webinar, 2 webinars today.
Oh, wow. Well, that is definitely good to get under your belt. So you know how to use the MLS. That's critical. So well worth the time.
Yeah.
And Tony, what about you? How's your day going?
Busy. Well, I actually work for a school district, so I'm like doing this until I can do it full time.
Oh, right
But it's the
on.
beginning of
Yeah.
the school year, so like we're crazy busy over here. So
Has school started for your district?
yeah, I started last week.
Oh, okay.
So both all my kids and then my district started.
Wow. That is a busy time of year, even just as a parent,
Yeah.
for sure. Oh, Chris Brooks is now in the waiting room for some reason. We will readmit him. He must have signed off accidentally or something. Oh, there you are. Sorry, I just noticed you were in the waiting room there.
No problem.
Okay. I think we were still talking about purchase price, or that was the last thing that we covered before we took a break. So I wanted to refer to the paragraph A on page 2 that has an explanation of an expansion on the concept of the purchase price. So this is kind of important because it says that the buyer will pay to seller the purchase price, including the earnest money, in cash at closing unless otherwise specified in their agreement. So what this means is that if your buyer wants a contingency so that they would have the legal right to exit the contract and get their earnest money back, say if they couldn't get their loan, you've got to put that addendum on. You've got to have a financing addendum on your contract. Otherwise, the language in this contract says buyer's paying in cash. So if they're going to be dependent on any funds that aren't right in their bank account, right? So whether it's a gift funds or it's a loan or it's down payment assistance or it's a grant or it's money from the tribe or Aunt Marge is giving them some money towards, or they're buying from their parents and they're going to give them a gift of equity, any other kinds of funds that isn't cash, you have to disclose that. And if you want the contingency, the protection for your buyer to get their earnest money back, if their financing falls through, you've got to put your contingency addendum on there. So, of course, if their offer is contingent on the sale of another property, then you'd be using that addendum as well. So and then there's another sentence at the end of that paragraph about using caution when wiring funds to avoid potential wire fraud. If your buyer is going to be wiring, most people will be wiring in, if not their earnest money, their down payment. The party wiring the funds, in other words, your buyer, should confirm any wire instructions via a phone number and other appropriate messages. And honestly, all the title companies, there are wire fraud warnings on just on everybody's signature block, and they send those out with great regularity. They have everybody sign a disclosure about wire fraud. It's a real thing. So it is an acceptable form of remittance, but you have to, use some common sense and verify the instructions that you get from the title company. And now a lot of title companies, certainly both the ones I worked for when I was an escrow closer, have portals where once you go into escrow, the clients get an invitation to, create a logon for that portal, and then they can send and receive documents securely through that portal. So that's one way that escrow can provide wiring instructions, is through a portal, or they can send an encrypted email that would require like a one-time password to open to the buyers, or they can send wiring instructions overnight UPS, or buyers can pick up wiring instructions in person at any of the offices. So it's a thing to be aware of. And this is also a good time when you're talking money with your buyer, i.e. purchase price, to talk about the amount of the down payment that the lender is going to require, because a lot of loans have specific requirements as to the amount that the buyer has to put down. And where is that money, and where is it coming from? Is it readily available? Is it liquid? Is this something that they're going to have to transfer out of an investment account, or liquidate, or get funds out of a retirement account? Is it, where's it coming from? And it's time to plan to make arrangements to get those funds liquid, so that they're going to be available in plenty of time for closing, because they won't be able to close without it. So that can be another question too for your lender. If we offer this much of a purchase price, and how much closing costs are they going to need, participation from the seller, and how much money are they going to have to bring to the table? And usually at this stage of the game, the lender will have an idea. They won't, once you get signed around, they'll issue a loan estimate, which will later be refined into a closing disclosure when all the fees and both title, escrow, and all the loan fees are going to be quantified for the buyers. So they'll have an idea, but to pinpoint the amount, you'll be much closer to closing to get that exact amount. Okay, let's go to earnest money. So again, this is a really important conversation to have with your buyer, and to understand what earnest money is, and when to deposit it, how to deposit it, and what it means. So it does, and how much should earnest money be? So your buyer will likely ask you, how much earnest money do I need to put down? So in order to answer that question, you have to know what it is. So earnest money serves two purposes. One, it is the amount of liquidated damages if the buyer defaults. So if the buyer changes their mind, or they want out of the transaction and they have no contingencies to exercise, they'll sacrifice their earnest money. So if I'm going to say that again, their earnest money is at risk if they default. Don't tell your buyers, oh, if something goes wrong, you just get your earnest money back and then we'll find you something else. It's not always that easy. There are many disputes about earnest money and many lawsuits about earnest money. As for the other purpose of earnest money, it's kind of a psychological one. It says to the seller, I'm serious about buying your property, and here's some money to prove it. So it shows a little bit of financial acumen and ability for the buyer to say, I'm going to give you going to put X amount in escrow to show you that I'm really serious about this. But make sure your buyer knows that's their skin in the game, right? So anybody know how much earnest money should be?
Is that 1%?
1% is very commonly seen. That's true. And that's kind of the benchmark that we use generally. Do you have to have earnest money for a contract to be legal and binding?
No.
No, no
No.
earnest money is actually required. One of the things that's required for the validity of a contract is consideration. That means I'm going to give you something and you're going to give me something back. So in this case, the purchase price is the consideration. The promise from the buyer saying, I'm going to give you this money and you're going to give me the property. So that fills that requirement. So earnest money isn't really required, but I'll tell you, you almost always see it. The only time you don't see earnest money routinely included in a transaction, a purchase and sale, is say it's a family deal. You know, one relative selling to another. Another scenario might be a long-term tenant is buying from their landlord. Don't usually see earnest money in those deals either, but most of the time you're going to be dealing with earnest money. So paragraph B on page 2 has a lot of detail about earnest money, and we're going to run through this. So buyers shall deliver the earnest money by the delivery date listed in term 7. So you do have a line here for you to say, when is buyer going to deposit their earnest money? The default is 2 days. And it has to go in the contract. It says to the buyer brokerage firm or the closing agent. Well, it's always going to go to the closing agent. Who's the closing agent? It's escrow. So many times title and escrow are going to be the same company, but it's your earnest money is never going to come here to the firm because we don't have a trust account. And the Department of Licensing in the state of Washington have very strict laws and rules about handling other people's money. And it became very complicated and honestly risky. I know a lot of brokers who can tell you horror stories about having lost an earnest money check. Not a good thing. Anyway, about most firms in Washington no longer have trust accounts. I think only 5% of the firms still have a trust account, and we do not. So earnest money is always going to go to the closing agent. So your default time is 2 days for delivery of the earnest money. I'd really prefer that you don't take a paper check from your buyer and try to get it into escrow, but you can. The way that I'd like that to be done best is because there are so many different ways for the earnest money to get delivered to escrow, so they can, you can certainly do a promissory note, although I don't think that's the strongest option for your offer, but there is a form for that, the earnest money promissory note. It can be sent in with a personal check if your closing date is at least 10 business days after mutual acceptance. You can use a cashier's check, or your buyer can, if your closing date is at least 1 to 3 days after mutual. 1 day for in-state banks and 3 days for out-of-state banks. They can wire transfer their funds in. So to manage all the logistics of how what they're going to pick based on where they are and what their resources are and where escrow is, it's really easier to get them connected to escrow from the get-go. And so one way to do that is to put the buyer's contact information on the front page of your purchase and sale. However, if your buyer doesn't want that included there, and a lot of people don't put client details on there because, frankly, I think they don't want the buyer and seller to have the, have that personal contact. They want, as is proper, they want everybody to be communicating through their brokers, right? So what you do is when you send over your signed around purchase and sale to escrow and say, you know, here's my new deal, yay, open up escrow. You're going to say, please contact my buyer and arrange for the deposit of earnest money. It is due on blank, whatever. You know, if it's, we got signed around on Tuesday morning, you're sending it over Tuesday at 2 p.m. Say it is due by Thursday. And make sure that your buyer knows what the amount is and when it's due. They're going to have a lot of emotion surrounding getting their offer written and accepted. So, you know, that's one thing you really have to emphasize with them. And this sounds kind of self-evident because I know you as responsible brokers are always giving your clients a copy of everything they've signed as soon as they've signed it. But I'll tell you, I was in escrow for a long time, and it was kind of shocking to me how many buyers would call up and say, oh, I just had my offer accepted, and my agent said something about earnest money, but I don't know how much it is. And when do I have to have that in by? And then how will I get it to you? You know, just, I was like, wow, okay. I'm going to send you a copy of your purchase and sale, sir. And here it says that, you know, your earnest money is $5,000. Oh yeah, now I remember. Okay. And then you can kind of, the escrow person can talk over the possibilities for the deposit. Some other options are they can send the client a prepaid UPS or a FedEx label. They can pick up a check from a brokerage via courier. A lot of escrow companies will do that for you. They'll say they can't send a courier to a residence, but they can send a courier to a business. So they could even pick up a check from your client at their place of business or their place of employment. But honestly, you're under a time constraint here, and I would, you know, put your buyer in touch with escrow. So in essence, delegate and follow up. Don't just don't put them in touch with escrow and then assume everything's done. You got to follow up and make sure, talk to your buyer. You talk to escrow. What are your plans for getting in earnest money? When is it going to be deposited? So that you get that deposited. If your buyer does not timely deposit their earnest money, the seller has the right to terminate the transaction. You don't want to lose out on a great deal for your client because you didn't follow up with your buyer to make sure they got their earnest money deposited by the deadline. And again, another conversation with your buyer is, where is this money coming from? Is it readily available in your checking account that you can wire it in, or you can write a check, or you can get a cashier's check? Is it coming from a relative? Does the relative have liquid funds? Is the relative in state? I remember one time we had a buyer was like, oh, well, you know, Aunt Marge is going to take care of the earnest money. Isn't that great? Well, yeah, it's great. But Aunt Marge lived in Chicago, didn't have email, you know, didn't understand, you know, kind of just put the check in the mail. Well, no, we're going to miss our deadline. So, you know, didn't have a printer. I mean, the story goes on. You can see how complicated it can get, right? Not everybody is connected to technology, and you have to know where those funds are coming from because you've got this contractual obligation for the buyer to get their earnest money in. Certainly, if they say something like, oh, we're putting $120,000 down in earnest money, wouldn't that be nice to have like a, you know, $1.2 million deal, and you have this big chunk of earnest money, and we need a couple of extra days to move some money around? Well, you can put that down. You can say, you know, buyer's going to deposit their earnest money in 4 days or 5 days. Be realistic about that. Also be prepared to field the question from the listing agent, why do they need so much time to deposit their earnest money? And you can, you know, the larger amounts, you know, I don't think would be questioned so hard, but just make sure you have the conversation with their buyer. Where is the earnest? How much? Where is it coming from? How's it going to get deposited? And the consequences if they don't deposit it on time is a couple days longer. You know, the seller might have another offer sitting around, or they might have another interested party and they'll say, oh, this guy hadn't deposited his earnest money. I guess he's not too serious. Let's terminate him and go with buyer number 2. You don't want that to happen. So if the agreement is terminated, there is a form to release the earnest money. If you are rescinding a transaction, you would use form 51. But if you're exercising a contingency and merely asking escrow to disperse the earnest money, then you would use a form 50. It's aptly named authorization to disperse earnest money. Form 51 is a rescission. And a lot of brokers make the mistake that if they're exercising a rescission, exercising a contingency, then they use a rescission to direct earnest money release for escrow. But it's not going to invalidate it, but it's not the correct form, and it might confuse the other agent. So you want to use the correct form. So what happens if a buyer does exercise a contingency, or has the contractual right to the refund of the earnest money upon the form of termination? Say they don't get their financing and they provide all the correct documentation, but the seller doesn't want to release it. Well, that does happen, and there is a process for that. So if either party doesn't sign the release form, then a party can make a written demand to escrow for the earnest money. And then escrow delivers a notice of demand to the other party within 15 days. And if that other party doesn't object to the demand within 20 days, then the escrow can disperse the earnest money. Now, if an agreement is never reached, then escrow will instigate what's called an interpleader action. And that would happen within 60 days of an objection or an inconsistent demand. And what's an interpleader? Well, it's basically a lawsuit between the parties. They're suing each other over the earnest money. So there's a whole, this is a whole process that's outlined here in the second part of paragraph B on page 2. And interpleader cost, the initial cost is $750. One of my goals in my job is to keep my brokers and their clients out of court. So, when you're suing someone, it's expensive, it's time consuming. And a lot of times people are letting emotion run their, decision-making process, as opposed to contractual right or obligation, or even just the right thing to do. Sometimes people do it. I had recently, we had one seller who was, the buyer, couldn't get their loan. The seller felt that they hadn't made a good enough effort to do so, and they felt greatly inconvenienced that the deal fell apart. So they wouldn't release the buyer's earnest money for some time because they wanted to punish the buyer. And it did cause a lot of distress to the buyer because they needed that money back. But after a sufficient time where the seller then felt that the buyer had suffered enough, finally his broker, who was our broker, talked some sense into him, and he did release the earnest money. So he had no contractual right to it. But I will say that when you get into these disputes, in these situations, it is so much better to have your earnest money in escrow. So you might be thinking, well, why wouldn't it always be in escrow? Well, you'll find that as you get into working sometimes brokers will look for some element to strengthen their offers in a competitive market. And that might be to release the earnest money to the seller early. That means it goes from escrow right into the seller's pocket. I really don't encourage this. It used to be that the early release of earnest money was really only done as kind of a trade-off for a concession. Like you're getting up to closing date and lender needs more time, we're gonna have to extend the closing date. So buyer says to seller, my lender's running behind and we need another week. And the seller says, okay, well, I'll extend it, but you release the earnest money to me in a good faith effort. So, if you're sure you're closed, shouldn't be a problem. So they do that. And that I can understand better than just, as soon as you sign off on this, I'm going to release, $20,000 of earnest money to you, Mr. Seller. Then if anything at all goes wrong, that money's not in escrow, not in a neutral third party. It's in the seller's pocket, and it's going to be a lot of work to get that back. Also, I want you to remember the spirit of compromise if you ever do get into an earnest money dispute. And that means that everybody gives something, nobody gets everything, but you come to an agreement where the parties can agree and exit the transaction without getting legal entanglement. If you're a suit like this can easily last a year, and when you're looking at paying attorney fees of $400 an hour plus court costs, whoever loses this kind of case is going to pay not only their own court costs and legal fees, but the other sides as well. So if you're looking at even $5,000-$10,000 of earnest money is quickly going to be exceeded that amount over a very short period of time. And if it goes to an appeal process, it can last even longer. So it's always best to try to keep people out of court. And then finally, about earnest money, I want to say that you can't say that any amount must be put down, because you now all understand that there is no required amount. It's negotiable. It could be zero. You can say something like it's customary, to put 1% down, certainly not a requirement. We're looking at all these different components on making an attractive offer that the seller's going to accept, but it's totally up to you. Okay, how are we doing? Any questions?
Quick question. What are you going to mention that? Is that during the offer, or is that after mutual acceptance?
What?
Where are you gonna tell them how much you're gonna? When are you gonna tell them how much you're gonna put for earnest money?
Oh, when you're writing the offer with them.
Okay.
So you've taken buyers out to show them properties, and they say, "Oh, we love that house on North M Street in Tacoma, and we want to, make an offer." Say, "Okay, great. Let's sit down and hammer out our terms. I need to, I have some questions I'll need to ask the listing agent and your lender and you, so that we can get all of the terms correct." So it's then when you're writing the offer that you'll discuss that, along with, purchase price and expiration date, purchase price, closing date, earnest money, all of those things. Oh, was that? I thought you said you had two questions. No, just one?
No, just one. Yeah.
Oh. Okay. So on the purchase and sale, I'll point out that there used to be a box to check what form you're using to deposit your earnest money, whether it was going to be a check, a note, a wire, or whatever. That's been removed because they feel that the philosophy is that a timely deposit is more important than the method that you're using to deposit the earnest money, because there's a variety of methods that are acceptable. I think I said, personal check, note, promissory note, wire, also cashier's check, also money orders. I mean, I've worked with clients before that, you're putting down, I don't know, say 1,000 or 2 in earnest money, and money orders are also acceptable. Of course, it has to be in United States currency. And we talked about time frames for earnest money deposit. So number 8 is the default provision. So if the buyer, again, defaults on the contract, in other words, they want out of the contract, but they've got no legal recourse to retrieve their earnest money, you are always going to check forfeiture of earnest money. The other option is seller's election of remedies. So you certainly don't want to put your buyer in a position where the seller is deciding how much inconvenience, pain, and suffering they have from the buyer defaulting on this transaction and demanding a certain amount of performance from your buyer. So line 8 is always, just like line 7, you're always going to check closing agent for who's holding the earnest money. Line 8, you are always going to check forfeiture of earnest money on that line. And the paragraph O on page 5 details out what default means. So in the event buyer fails without legal excuse to complete the purchase of the property, then the following provision shall apply. That portion of the earnest money that does not exceed 5% of the purchase price shall be forfeited to the seller as the sole and exclusive remedy available to seller for such failure. Seller's election of remedies. The seller can keep the earnest money as liquidated damages, or he can bring suit against the buyer for seller's actual damages. He can bring suit to specifically enforce this agreement and recover any incidental damages, or pursue any other rights or remedies available at law or equity. So you can see why we don't want to give that seller those options. Okay, well, I've left a little bit here at the end we're about halfway through. For any questions or comments or anything else that you'd like to discuss about what we've covered today. No, anybody have words of wisdom or questions about any addenda?
I had a quick question. When you're in the middle of a situation, say, you're unavailable, but you're struggling to find a certain form, is there a good resource we could keep at our fingertips to help us quickly identify what form we need for a unique situation?
That's usually, either a call for your mentor or a Susan call. Okay. And remember that I do take urgent calls, urgent communications outside of office hours. You can always, the best way to do it is to text me and say, and I get these all the time. I know you guys are out working nights and weekends, and it is routine for me to, talk to 1 or 2 people each night. And, I get a number of contacts on the weekends, and usually they're pretty quick questions, but I certainly would rather talk to you about it before you guess than to have you use an incorrect form and open up some horrible liability for your client that you didn't intend to do, right? So the best way is to text me and say, because, on the weekends I'm not, and even in the evening sometimes, I'm not necessarily sitting at my computer like I do all day. But if you text me and say, I need to talk to you, can you call me? Or I need to send a contract for you to look at. I'm trying to get my offer submitted today. Or, one call I got not too long ago was, I took my clients to see a property and the dogs ran out and bit my clients. Help, call me. You know, everything from dog bites to disputes, right? So my cell phone number is 253-709-5513. If you're in the office, my card's at the front desk. You can always grab that. And it's best just to shoot me a text and tell me what you need. I need to talk to you, or you know, I need you to look at something, you know, and a lot of times I'll be like driving around or something, and I'll say, well, I'm you know, I'll call you back shortly, or I'm driving right now. I'll put you on speaker and say, I'm driving right now, but I'll be at my destination in 15 minutes and I'll call you back and we'll get you taken care of, so that you're not, you don't have to guess, don't have to struggle along on your own. I'll
Okay,
help you.
sounds great.
And you know, honestly, I get mostly calls from experienced agents. So don't feel like, oh, I shouldn't ask this question or I should know this answer. None of us know all the answers, but you know, we can definitely figure it out. And I work with the forms all day long. So a lot of them I do know by heart, but with all the new ones in July, you know, I have to look stuff up too. So again, we'll figure it out together. I see we have a new agent on board. Welcome. Did she pass her test, Tony? Okay, awesome. Okay, well, we're about 10 till, and I'm gonna close up shop, and I thank you all for being here. I'm so proud of each of you for taking the time to broaden your knowledge base so that you understand the forms and how to use them. It's going to serve you well in the future, and I sure hope to see you next time for part 2. Thanks so
See you
much.
next week.
Have a great day. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank
So
you.
much.